Thank you again, Priyanka, for the quick introduction. And thank you all for joining today. Thank you, Zino, for setting up this session. I know a lot of people are already aware of what is DevOps. So in this session, we'll talk more about what we need to do to ensure success with DevOps. And more importantly, how we measure success. So some of the things might be obvious to many of you guys, but I would like to share what we are doing at BMC with respect to DevOps. So with that, without wasting any more time, we'll kind of get into what is the agenda for today. So we'll talk a bit about the DevOps culture because it is important to get the mindsets geared towards the culture that is needed for success with DevOps. We'll also talk about the maturity levels, the set of KPIs that we have come up with internally at BMC to measure success. And finally, we'll have a bit of technical deep dive into how we achieved what we have and then how we plan to get to the next level. Like I think Priyanka said, I plan to spend like close to 40-45 minutes with my talking, and then of course we'll have time for Q&A towards the end. So I think everyone will agree that there should be no boundary between the dev and ops with respect to DevOps, which means that the responsibility to make sure that your services is up and running and functional is shared across the set of people, right from the person who wrote the code to the person who is managing this code in production. Which means that the developers need to be cognizant about the fact that they cannot write, let's say, a bad SQL query that is unnecessarily utilizing the database and then expect the ops to kind of provision more capacity. Especially with SaaS services, you also need to be considering the cost of running your code in production. In most cases, it needs to be estimated down to the dollar value. So this means that there should be a lot of collaboration, no silos, cross-functional teams, and more importantly, those teams should be able to execute independently without a lot of hindrance. That means that every team is now responsible for deploying their code to production. So now how does the management get confidence about the quality of the services and avoid unhappy customers? Now all this is possible only if you build quality into the development process, which means that everything is automated and owned by the team, right from the builds to executing tests, measuring the quality of code, and deployments to various stages all the way to production. And of course, there should be a way to kind of enforce governance, quality checks, and more importantly, the feedback process. I mean, feedback in this process, right, to ensure confidence that the automation is set up in the right way and it is working as expected. And this is what we'll kind of talk about more in the later slides. Now, I think that this slide should be familiar to most of you. I mean, there is like already a lot of literature out there that explains this in detail. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just voice over the key highlights or the structure. And that's how we'll kind of go through this. So there are like five levels that are kind of there, and then there are like five categories. Right? The rows are the categories, and the columns are basically the levels. Right? I brought up this slide here because it helps build the foundation for this discussion and also helps achieve the set of DevOps goals and the KPIs for measuring success against those goals. Now, maybe the text is small here, but I want to make sure that I use the same image here so that it kind of sounds familiar to most of the people. Now, if you look at the culture and organization, they say base means dev have their own prioritized backlogs. But there is like a different dev and QA team. They're kind of working in silos. With beginner level, the dev and QA are kind of working together as one team. I mean, with the intermediate, the dev, QA, and ops is like working together as one team. But you are still making your quarterly or 6 monthly releases, right? Which goes through, let's say, a certification process to be GA. At the advanced level, you have the competence to release features to production outside of the release cycles. And at the expert level, you have all the automation in place to quickly roll out changes to production in short period of time, which means that the failures can be fixed very quickly. and roll forwarded into the production. That means that there is no need to roll back anything. Now moving on to the design and architecture. Base means that, let's say, just to create an analogy, you have like a monolithic application, the traditional monolithic application. Beginner means that you have broken down your applications into modules, and you have a system in place for managing your third-party libraries and, let's say, even internal dependencies using tools like Maven or NPM repositories, etc. Intermediate means that you have your components separately deployable. You are looking towards building microservices here. At advanced level, you take the API first approach. That is, all communication is strictly over APIs and all components are releasable with a business value, so that you get the benefit of making short and frequent releases. And at the expert level, you kind of try to minimize the shared infrastructure dependency for your component to ensure that you define your infrastructure as a code. I mean, this helps with reducing complexity and cost of processes and environments, especially like disaster recovery. Moving on to like the build and deploy category. Base, it says the code is in the version control system. You have builds which are kind of configured at schedule intervals, but the deployment is kind of manual. Beginner, you are kind of polling for changes, and so builds are more frequent now. Intermediate, basically builds are kind of triggered from source control system like Git, let's say on events like commit or PR merge, etc. I'm going to be like, this is going to be a little bit more technical. And then you have the deployment pipelines in place, right, that covers all the stages all the way up to production. For example, you build the container image once and then deploy it to multiple environments in the right order of your promotion. At the advanced level, you have, let's say, zero downtime deployments. You are, let's say, using strategies like blue, green, red, black, right? And then you have you have automated your, let's say, database migrations. Expert is kind of nirvana. It's like a zero-touch deployment. You check in something and it gets pushed to production without any manual intervention. Looking at the test and the verification stage, it says that your unit test is the only thing that is automated at the base level. Beginner, you have started automating your integration test, right? But the environment still needs to be real. With the intermediate level, you try to run your integration test with, let's say, mocked dependent services, which helps reduce both time and complexity. At the advanced level, you expect the acceptance, performance, security tests to be kind of fully automated and baked into your pipelines. And we'll discuss briefly about how we kind of achieve that in the later slides. And finally, the last and the most important part of the process, which is reporting and feedback. So how do you measure your processes to understand where we are and where we need to go? Again, at the base level, you have the KPIs identified, but it is measured manually and maybe on demand. At the beginner level, you start scheduling your automated reports for some of the KPIs, if not all. At the intermediate level, you have your build, test, deploy pipelines established, and now you can start seeing the historical reports for these pipelines. It is giving you insights into how efficient or stable your pipeline or environment is. If there are like a lot of failures, you know that there is a problem either in pipeline, environment, etc. At the advanced level, you've started making frequent releases to production. So you need real-time profiling insights into your environment. Like you will kind of start employing service mesh like Istio, etc. Also, you can start tracking the dynamic test coverage in terms of what all APIs were not called when my automated acceptance tests were run, and how is the distribution of API calls across all microservices, etc. At the expert level, your users would kind of expect to see like a self-service dashboards and alerts that are customized to his or her needs based on his or her function. So now, considering this maturity model, I just want to reiterate like what are the key objectives of continuous integration, continuous delivery, and continuous deployment. And I'll try to again like elaborate a bit here. And after that, we'll kind of jump into the design of the pipelines. So the key assumption here with the continuous integration is that you have a single shared repository for your component or a microservice. Anyone can submit changes to the top of the master branch of repository anytime, of course, with gatekeeping in place. And the developer should be aware that the changes submitted will get pushed to production as soon as possible. That means that you try to left shift a lot of tests into the process or the CI job that enables you to submit your change to the master branch. And we'll talk about that in the later slides. With the continuous delivery, we talked about it in a lot of detail in the previous slide, right? And the key objective here is that as soon as a change is made to repository, it should get pushed to production within a fixed time interval. An objective is always to find ways to reduce this time. Key difference between the continuous deployment and the continuous delivery is that with continuous deployment, there is no manual intervention. I would say that if you have achieved the expert level with continuous delivery, you can say that you are doing continuous deployment. So we saw the high level objectives. Now what we'll do is we'll break down those high level objectives into smaller objectives and try to measure them. So here is a list of KPIs that we try to measure at BMC. Now, some of them are kind of measured manually. Some of them are measured using automated tools. And some, I would say, we are still figuring out how to measure. The list on the left is related to continuous integrations, and the list on the right is related to deployment and operations. Now, these KPIs together provide confidence about the quality of the change the team is making, and also understand what needs focus in terms of moving to the next level with respect to the DevOps journey. Now, by any means, this is not the complete list. This is just the list that we have come up with, and we are continuously learning and improving on how to and what to measure. So let's start with left, and then we'll move towards right. Unit test, there are several tools to measure coverage. Objective here is to get 100% coverage. We have implemented packed for contract testing for some of our microservices. Objective is to ensure that all APIs have a contract test. So try to measure what percentage of APIs do not have contract tests and how effective those tests are. We have embedded the SonarQube, Nessus, etc. into our CI job to ensure things like static code analysis, third-party vulnerability, third-party library vulnerability assessment after every change that is kind of submitted, and ensure that the CI job fails if there are security issues detected. Objective again here is to ensure zero security defect leaking into your master branch of repository. We also use IBM AppScan for dynamic testing, and of course, it requires like a dedicated environment for testing right now. Now, with containers, a lot of time you do not have control over the base images that the developer will end up using. Of course, you can build company-based images and ask everyone to use, right? But it depends on the due diligence of the individual teams. So it is necessary to ensure the container images are also scanned for security issues, and even compliance violations like things like processes running as root user inside the container, etc., should be scanned for. So we use Claire for scanning the containers, and we use our own products that help with container compliance. Objective again here is to kind of ensure zero defects. Now, acceptance test is a bit tricky, I would say, because you want to ensure that all the combinations are tested. But if you try doing that, it will take endless hours. And the key objective is to ensure that the acceptance test gets completed within a fixed amount of time frame without compromising the coverage. Now, a lot of aspects of the acceptance can be covered with contract testing. So what we're trying to do is increase the contract test coverage and reduce the number of acceptance tests so that we can finish them in a fixed time frame. So the question is that how do we measure whether we have a good coverage or not? I would say it is still a manual judgment for us right now, and we're kind of trying to improve on that. Performance test is extremely important, especially with multi-tenant applications. We try to divide this into two parts. One is like what all APIs were tested for performance, right? And second is like what were the failure rates and the response times, like min, max, and average response time for each API. For the second part, you would start using service mesh like Istio. I mean, it provides you all profiling tools out of, or all the profiling that you need out of the box, and you get those reports, and you can also run Grafana queries that help you make automated decisions into whether you can call the performance test successful or not. All right, now I'll kind of come to the right side of the picture. So deployment frequency is like how often you push to production. Is it quarterly, monthly, weekly, daily, or on every change? Objective is to be able to push every change to production. Deployment time we divide into two parts. One is the time to deploy a component to any given environment. Objective should be to ensure that this is in few minutes or even in seconds. And second is a time frame from a point a change was submitted to the version control system and the time that change got churned into, let's say, a software and got deployed to production. We need to be able to measure this time as well, whether you have automation in place or not, and work towards reducing this time in days or even in hours. Now, this is largely dependent on the KPIs on the left side, right? But this gives us a good picture about how things are getting impacted at a later stage if we don't give attention to the processes early in the pipelines. I think service response time, failure rates, I'm sure there are a lot of monitoring tools out there to measure them and create alerts. Again, service mesh like Istio basically will be like a better approach here. Now we have to acknowledge and accept that there will always be defects and outages, even though you have the best quality process in place. So you need to be able to design for a system that can be fixed very quickly without compromising or bypassing any of the processes. This is also kind of dependent on other KPIs like deployment time, frequency, etc. But we kind of put it up explicitly because this also helps in understanding the actual SLA. This is particularly helpful with the roll forward strategy that we discussed to achieve the expert level with the maturity model. Normally, one would say that we will roll back if a defect is identified in production, right? But rollbacks are not easy. It can become very complex, especially if you have automated database migrations baked into your pipelines. Downtime, I think everyone understands. Reducing the manual maintenance is also very important. This is more on the ops side of things, I would say, especially if you have things like DR sites. So with that, we'll get into like how do we design a set of pipelines that helps us measure and achieve the objectives that we have laid out for ourselves. So based on several experiments and learning over the past few years, this is the current state of maturity that we are at right now. I would say we are at between intermediate for some categories and for some we are at advanced. From tooling perspective, we are using Helm, we are using kind of Jenkins, and we're kind of using Spinnaker for our deployment pipelines. Now, on the left side, we have the dev pipeline. Right? The dev pipeline is a Spinnaker template-based pipeline with multiple steps, calling, in some cases, calling like some of the steps will be calling one or more Jenkins job. Now, this pipeline gets triggered when an engineer raises a PR or a pull request. What we do is we try to left shift all the automated tests as much as possible so that the engineer can find potential issues in this code much earlier and fix them. Now, if any of the tests fail, or for example, let's say the code coverage, right, is not met, the expected code coverage is not met, then the pipeline will fail and the engineer will be required to fix all the issues, or let's say add more unit tests to ensure code coverage to get to the next level. Until then, he will not be able to kind of merge his changes to the master branch of the repository. As a part of the dev pipeline, we only build the code and run the test locally on the artifacts that were built. The QA pipeline is again a Spinnaker-based pipeline, which has the Jenkins jobs to kind of build artifacts. It is triggered when a PR is merged into the master of the repository. It is expected to generate build artifacts of the master branch, create a container image, scan for security issues, and then publish those and publish that container to the container repository. It will also kind of deploy the newly built microservice container into an isolated environment along with dependent REST services which are kind of mocked. Now there are like mock servers which are available to make the mocking simple and easy. Then you have the automated test suite, which is kind of confined to this specific microservice in question, and rest of the environment is controlled. So you are kind of testing first functional aspect of this particular microservice. You can also configure to run DEST at this stage, like the dynamic application security testing, and also have some form of PSR testing, right, to some extent, to test things like parallel API calls and measuring response times, etc., at a much lower scale. Let's say like you're testing only like one container to ensure that that smallest unit of your microservice is kind of performing as expected. Traditionally, for us, we did not have dependent mock services, but we had real services on the QA pipeline. Now, this is fine when you have less number of teams working in parallel and not many microservices like, let's say, up to 20. But then when you grow, that's when things start becoming complex and get out of control. So at that point, you have two options. You kind of create a different environment for each service, but that is very expensive and it's maintenance nightmare. Second option is to have a shared dedicated environment and then make sure that only one service can run this QA pipeline at any given point in time. Right? You're kind of creating really a bottleneck here at the QA pipeline level. This is also not feasible because we want to, because it kind of increases the overall deployment time for every change significantly, because now all the changes are kind of getting stacked up into your pipeline. So at some point, it is necessary to use these mock services at this stage. So better plan for that early in your design. Right. So basically, the dev and the QA pipelines are kind of running in parallel for all the microservices. Now, once the QA pipeline is, and we'll kind of elaborate this a little bit more on the next slides. So once the QA pipeline is green and all tests have passed, then the integrated QA pipeline gets auto-triggered. Right. This is like a single environment, and I can say that as soon as a PR is merged, the change gets deployed to this environment within few hours. And then you have like a separate test suite, which is more focused on integration use cases, or let's say acceptance use cases, right? And we'll talk about what happens in case of failures in the next slide. There is a solution QA environment where the deployment of all the integrated QA qualified builds gets deployed on a nightly basis. Now there are, this is where, I mean, basically right now for us, it is on a nightly cadence. Now there are like cross product use cases that we are trying to test here. Now even integrations with like third-party products. You can skip this solve QA step if you have just one product or a SaaS service that you are supporting, and there is not much of integration with third-party products that you really need to test. We also have like a dedicated environment in parallel to solve QA environment, and this is where we run the larger end-to-end PSR testing, and of course, on a need basis for different services or products. It is both manual as well as automated. We also run manual, automated, and security tests and penetration testing to ensure high level of security for our services. Again, the idea is that whatever is manually tested today should have an automated test tomorrow to avoid repeating the same manual test again and again. Now, this is where the manual coordination that happens to decide when to push the builds accumulated in Solve QA to stage. So for example, if there is a brand new feature which got deployed and it requires significant amount of PSR and even penetration testing before release to end users, then it is ensured that the necessary tests are automated before enabling those changes, right? And then we are still pushing all these changes to the next level, but they are kind of in disabled state. And we'll talk about like the feature flags that we kind of use in the subsequent slides in terms of how do we kind of still incrementally push the changes to production, and then at the same time you're kind of not exposing your products to directly to the end users or customers. So then the builds are kind of pushed to the stage manually today, and there are like some smoke tests. Of course, we have pipelines to kind of deploy everything to different environments, but those pipelines are kind of triggered manually today versus being triggered automated. And then there are some smoke tests that we run, and then there are like we also run some of the automated security tests, which we kind of do to ensure sanity. And then finally the bits gets pushed to production with a zero downtime, of course during off peak hours. So this is like a complete journey of a change all the way from the dev to kind of production. Now, a little bit more detail here and just a recap on previous slide, like how pipelines are organized. So we said that you have multiple services and the dev and the QA pipeline for each service, or sorry, the dev pipeline for each service is invoked when a PR is raised. And the QA pipeline for each service is invoked when a PR is merged to master. Now, majority of the qualification is expected to be complete when a PR is merged to the master. I mean, that is what the expectation is. The integration pipeline is triggered as soon as the QA is successfully completed. All products on the same platform are deployed into a single environment here. I mean, the environments before the integration are kind of isolated and they were kind of running with mock dependencies in a lot of cases. So for integration pipeline, this means that you are kind of allowing only one execution at a time. And of course, this is a bottleneck. So, I mean, the changes are kind of getting stacked up here. End-to-end automation for a product is executed in this environment. And of course, there is intelligence in the automation to run only necessary test suits based on what has changed. If the test fail, then the last change that got deployed into this environment gets automatically rolled back from the environment. And of course, notifications are sent. We'll talk about dependency management again later in the slides. I have like one slide on dependency management. The sole QA pipelines are again, like we said, run nightly, and cross-product integration and even integration with third-party products are kind of tested in this environment. So this is like just a different diagram that kind of talks about the same thing, just to make it easier to kind of understand. So we talked about the dependency management in the previous slide, especially like what happens in case of failure. So let's say that I am building a service that is, let's say that I'm building like three services like A, B, and AB, right? And AB is kind of dependent on A and B is dependent on A, right? So basically, service. So whenever let's say that service A changes, right, or it is basically checked in, it will invoke the dev and the QA pipeline. Now, in parallel, the service B can also kind of make its changes, assuming the contracts and kind of mocking those contracts, etc. And they can continue to start building their feature, assuming the dependencies will be met by service A in future. Now, the service A gets into the integration but fails the test, and then let's say that the service A, right, it gets into the integration environment, and the automated test failed for whatever reason. And let's say those changes are rolled back from integration. So the service B also is at the same time trying to get into integration. But I mean, the service B is going to fail because A was not able to kind of push its changes into the integration, right, because of the failures. So since B has dependency on A, the B will also fail and it will also get automatically reverted. So this means that A must fix the issue first, and only then B can kind of roll forward after its dependency is met. So this way we kind of try to put some organic behavior into the pipelines. And of course, the assumption is that the test will kind of fail, right? To make sure that basically you're not kind of leaking the changes in B, like, I mean, which are dependent on A at the further stage. We also talked about feature flags and enabling features in production in previous slide. We'll try to deep dive a bit into the feature flag in this slide. The key objective here is that you have a new set of feature or a business value or an MVP that you want to deliver. And we want to incrementally push these features to production rather than making a big bang push. So of course it is not going to take, I mean, of course it is going to take like few months, right? It's not going to kind of finish in like a few weeks of time, or you'll not be able to deliver that in a sprint. So another important question here is that how do you expect all these integration tests, PSR tests, penetration tests, all this to be automated and written in parallel while your feature is being still developed? You also need to ensure that the quality of the automated test suite is also good. So what we typically do is that we create a feature flag for that use case, right? And what we do is we have a feature flag microservice to manage the feature flags. So the developers will write the feature code, which is protected by this flag across multiple features. The feature code undergoes all regression testing in lower environments, feature with the feature flag on, and even it gets to the production, but with the feature flag disabled. Now, teams responsible for different types of testing, or basically they'll kind of turn on the feature for their test environment. They'll kind of write their automation, they'll commit the automation to the automation repositories, and then they will enable the automated test for future. So once all the automated tests are in place, including security, PSR tests, that's when the feature is turned on by default. And then this change gets promoted all the way to production, resulting in enabling that feature for all tenants. So that's how we kind of try to manage this part of the problem right now. So now coming to the last part of my presentation, which is templates and governance. We have talked a lot of things in terms of design of pipeline, and you have a different requirement of structure of pipeline for each phase in your promotion model. You are asked to follow, basically you are asked to follow all this design, right, for every individual microservices. So if you have to kind of ask your teams to ensure that all this design of pipeline for every microservice, right, then it is going to take very long time for the teams to just create this pipeline. And even if they create it, there is no guarantee that each team will build their pipelines in a consistent way. So to ensure ease of onboarding new services, you need to enable your teams to be able to leverage a template for their pipelines and fill in only the steps within the pipeline which is specific to their microservice. So for example, in case of this dev pipeline, there can be a common job or a step, right, that can run your static code analysis on any directory that contains code. And then it can even generate, like, let's say your automated code coverage report from the unit test execution that kind of happened in an earlier step. And maybe it can also run your third-party software security scans like Nexus, etc. So these are the common steps the microservice teams don't need to bother writing. They should be part of the template. They just need to kind of plug in their build scripts, unit test execution, and let's say contract test execution into the pipeline. And unless they don't provide the build script, they don't run this unit test and the required code coverage, right? And even the contract test, this pipeline is going to fail. That means that you are enforcing governance, you are not allowing the changes to be kind of moved forward into your promotion model without some of these key aspects to be fulfilled. And then that also means that you also have uniformity across all your pipelines. And of course, like I said, like you're able to kind of enforce governance that all microservices, let's say, must have 80% code coverage with respect to the unit test execution. And say you want to kind of increase this code coverage from, let's say, 80% to 90% later. Then you can make that change in the template right here, and it becomes effective with all your pipelines. So the ability to push our changes, the governance changes with respect to our pipelines also become very simple with the template-based approach. Spinnaker does provide the ability to define pipeline templates, and we have found it kind of helpful to solve some of these problems. There are like a lot of other tools that kind of support same set of functionality, and it's kind of open, like it's up to like individual discretion what tools to kind of use. Also, I have not talked about Helm chart, but we do package all our microservices as Helm charts. Now, even in case of Helm charts, we have created base Helm library charts, and all microservices are expected to extend the base chart to achieve the same benefits that we talked about with respect to pipelines. Now, I will not get into a lot of details with example here, but I think that the benefits should be clear. So I think that, yeah, so I think that concludes our story, right, of, let's say, story of software from source code to production. And these are like the key takeaways. And I think we are open for questions right now. Over to you, Priyanka.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Saif. Actually, I do have a couple of aspects that I'd personally like to double click on, but I see a lot of audience questions. We have many questions coming in. So what I'm going to do is prioritize those and in no particular order, just try to filter them out in terms of what's most relevant. Anything that I'm not able to cover that might be a little bit too specific, if it's okay with you, Seth, we'll just drop you an email with those questions that I wasn't able to get to in the given time frame. And if you could respond to them at your convenience, we'll send them back to the attendees. Great. So the first one, and this is mainly around the maturity cycle that you'd shared with us. A question is coming in around how we envision the columns being observed. And the columns here were the culture and organization or design and architecture, build and deploy, etc. Right? So the question is, are they supposed to be done sequentially, so one after another, or can they all be executed parallelly, and how does that impact maturity? I'll just let you toggle back to that slide if you need to. But essentially, just wanted to understand if all of the columns being observed have to be done one after another, or can they be done at the same time?
I think all the columns can be done in parallel at the same time in collaboration with each other. That's what I would say. I mean, yeah, so I mean, these are all different categories or different aspects that you need to consider to kind of achieve the maturity model. So all of these will kind of go hand in hand. And then basically all these needs to be kind of worked on together, right, to kind of achieve your maturity model. For example, you cannot be lagging behind on your feedback process, right, while you're kind of, and you cannot be at an expert level with design and architecture, and then with information reporting, you are kind of at base. So you need to kind of progress all together with each of these rows in the right
Got
direction.
it. Right. Absolutely. Thank you so much. The next question is requesting you to shed a little bit more light on how to achieve continuous delivery and continuous deployment. There seems to be a common myth related to these two terms and the fact that both of them are being mixed at the same time. So how would you differentiate between the two?
Yeah, so I try to kind of cover that here in a sense, like ability to deploy every change into production within a fixed amount of time frame is basically what you're kind of talking about continuous delivery. And I think the key difference between continuous delivery and the deployment is that you're kind of doing with continuous deployment, there is no manual intervention. You've kind of automated all your testing and everything that is needed, right, without any manual intervention. So I think that's where the answer would be.
Got it, absolutely. So the biggest key takeaway in terms of difference is the extent of manual intervention between the two, right?
Right.
Got it. So the next question is around, what are some of the recommendations for looking at effectiveness of unit tests despite 100% coverage? There are many ways of writing unit tests with 100% coverage, no asserts, dummy asserts, etc. But the coverage doesn't add value to the process. So how do you look at effectiveness of unit tests above and beyond?
That's a great question. I would say, like, of course, we kind of try to make sure that we have all the code reviews and everything in place, right? And sure, yes. I mean, if you kind of look at it, right, this is like, I mean, we kind of talked about the culture here, right? So this is like more about the culture. You need to kind of have the complete the big picture about like what are, so basically there needs to be like a sense of responsibility across the team to make sure that, I mean, they are not writing any of these steps in this promotion pipe in this promotion model, right, for the sake of doing it, right? I mean, it has to be done in spirit. So I mean, yes, I think it is still kind of left to the manual judgment there, I would say.
Got it, got it. Just more intuition that there's no one right answer to something like that, right? Yes. Got it. Another question is around the KPIs slide that you had shared, where someone was assuming that most of those KPIs would be very valid for a mature product. But how do you start with KPI measuring in products in the early stage? So are there certain KPIs that are most essential to start with?
So I would say that you will not be able to achieve all those KPIs, right? So I would
Right.
say like you kind of go top bottom. So you start with
Hmm.
making sure your unit tests are good, and then you kind of go with your, let's say, contract test, security test,
Hmm.
container
Hmm.
test, and basically you need to kind of be able to make progress. Um, I mean, we kind of looked at all the different levels with respect to the maturity model. Again, like um, yeah, so I mean, this is what kind of answers it, right? So it test and verification. I mean, if you're kind of at the base level and you're not a mature product, right? You are at the base level, so which means that you have your automated unit there,
Absolutely.
and then I think this is how you'll kind of move right into your maturity model.
Hmm. Got it. Got it. So essentially, anyway, things like failure rate, etc., when you're still in the test stage, becomes a lot more important as KPIs than the rest of them.
Right. I think the idea here is that we need to be able to. I mean, these are the KPIs that we have identified we want to achieve. You will
Hmm.
not get,
Hmm.
let's say, 100% code coverage like the previous question. Ensure how do we ensure that this code coverage
Right.
is effective, right? So you start with, let's say, 50% code coverage, and then you kind of increase your level from 50 to 60 to 70 to make sure that, I mean, you kind of don't tell your teams that you need to be kind of 100% code coverage tomorrow. That is not going to happen. I mean, to be very practical.
Got it.
Right. So, I mean, you kind of set
Absolutely.
goals with respect to each of these KPIs, and then you kind of
Hmm.
move, you kind of raise the bar, right, for every KPI in terms of like how you want to mature.
Absolutely. Thank you, Seth. The next question is around whether it would make sense for DevOps for product and applications such as in-premise deployment and not on cloud. So essentially, I think the question here is how do you differentiate between DevOps processes that are on-premise versus on cloud?
Yeah, sure. So basically, I mean, we have the same challenge here. So, I mean, we kind of also have on-prem products. So, I mean, that is where
Hmm.
so if it is like on-prem product, right? I mean, the deployment is kind of left over to the customer. I mean, the deployment part of it is owned by the customer, right? So you still
Hmm.
have all your processes and all your
Right.
pipelines, and let's say you kind of still have your stage pipeline, right? You don't have a production, right? So
Hmm.
basically, this is where you're kind of qualifying your builds, and then you can kind of mature um, towards a model where basically you are kind of publishing, let's say, your containers into your Helm repository, right? And then
Hmm.
basically you can kind of have your customers kind of automatically or on a cadence kind of upgrade their microservices, right, from directly from the private Helm repository that you're kind of sharing with the customer. So, I mean, except for production, you're kind of still following everything, even for on-prem product.
Hmm. Understood. Understood. And do you think that there is one that's preferred over the other in certain situations, in terms of which one is more convenient to handle from a processes perspective?
Sorry, say again.
I just wondering to know whether you had an input in terms of which ones are more convenient to handle, whether it's on premise or on cloud. Are there certain characteristics that are best suited to certain processes?
You mean the character? I mean, what are kind? Okay, so what are the steps which are kind of not easy to handle in this process? Right. That's
Exactly. Exactly. Exactly.
I would say every step is having its is going to have its own challenge, and I think I mean we
Correct.
will need to kind of have uh, I mean again like the code coverage that was kind of brought up the question, right?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
every step is going to have its on on challenge. I would say
Hmm.
I mean as you kind of practice this more and more, right? I mean it is going to get better. For example, like things like the PSR testing and security testing, we are kind of doing it in parallel right now because
Hmm.
we are kind of still figuring out like, uh, I mean, you cannot do your PSR and manual penetration testing while the feature is still being developed. So how do you kind of and I mean the kind of the time that you have with respect to like one sprint, right? I mean, the idea is that you should be able to kind of deliver value in a single sprint. with respect to the agile processes that we follow.
Got it.
Now the sprints,
Right.
the size of the sprint is very short. So how do you kind of put all these things together, or kind of compact this everything into like a single sprint? And so, I mean, you obviously you cannot do everything in parallel. So, um, I mean, these are like some of the key challenges in like the maturity model.
Mm-hmm.
So we have been able to kind of, let's say, automate everything until here, but then we are kind of still figuring out how to kind of make the right side of the picture like the completely automated process.
Absolutely. Understood. So to that point, there's another question around this pipeline. So the question says, do we have any best practice uh, that can constantly check in terms of the pipeline flow run? What would happen if there's a code that checks in every 30 minutes? Does it take more time to execute QA or performance when you're comparing the two?
Right. So the idea is that you should be able to make frequent changes to your repository, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is the whole idea. So
Mm-hmm.
even if someone is making a change every 30 minutes,
Mm-hmm.
it should still be able to kind of move to production.
Tracking.
And that
Right.
is where we are saying that we need to kind of have clear distinction between like what is it that I'm going to test on in the dev pipeline, what
Mm-hmm.
the QA and all the different steps, right? And then these tests should not overlap. If there are overlaps, then certainly it is going to take a longer time. I think we kind of touched upon this in like one of the previous slides
Right.
in the discussion. So I mean, that is what we had in the KPI. So we have to find, and that is like again a tricky thing. I mean, um, you kind of get perfection with practice, right? So that's where I think it's not like easy again. You have to kind of practice it more and more, and then I think we should be able to get it.
Got it. So there are also lots of questions here, Saif, around the tools that are being used both by BMC and just market available tools, which can manage and track all these different stages of DevOps framework, as well as reporting and basically just track the outcomes. Here, I'll just please feel free to share whatever information is possible in terms of what BMC does, but any other market available information that you're aware of um, for these.
Um, there are like a lot of tools available. I mean, even Jenkins you can use to kind of
Mm-hmm.
do the pipelines. I mean, we'll not be able to get into a lot of details here,
Understood.
but I mean, there are like as you kind of get into your as you kind of get into if you as you start practicing this, I mean, you'll kind of identify more and more challenges, and
Mm-hmm.
I mean, based on all those challenges and learnings, right? I mean, we found that Spinnaker is doing a better job for us, especially
Okay,
with respect to that the governance and the templates that we talked about in the last slide.
got it, got it. Um, So there's one more question around cost benefits of 100% automation of functional testing versus automating regression tests in the scenario where requirements are constantly evolving. So how do you balance the two, especially in the case of 100% automation, where you might not be able to input constantly evolving client requirements?
Um, Balancing, I would say like the way you kind of think about it is, I mean, and I think, um, I mean, you have like three key challenges, right? I mean, basically, you want to kind of build a reliable automated feedback process,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And then basically, you do not have the time and all the time and investment to kind of build such a picture,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I think it has to be like a balanced approach in a way, in a sense like I mean it again goes back to the same maturity model that we kind of talked about,
Right.
right? So basically you kind of try to kind of get towards the right in the maturity model, and
Mm-hmm.
based on your time and investment, right, to decide that this is the, I mean these are the maturity model that I need to kind of uh, so let's say that you're targeting intermediate, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then you kind of need to know like where are you right now, right? That is what you need to kind of assess, right?
Correct.
And then you need to be able to move in all these directions. I mean,
Got
all
it.
the different categories. You need to be able to move right. So I would say like the time and the investment would be to kind of fill all the holes,
Mm-hmm.
right, that you have on and at the base column, and then you kind of put all your focus to kind of make sure that you are at base. and then you kind of move on to the next level. And that's
Got
how
it.
this model kind of helps you. And basically, it helps you in balancing in terms of where you need to focus in terms of
Mhm.
putting your time and investment, and eventually kind of move towards like fully automated process.
Got it. So actually, just a question on that as well is in terms of, do you have a an opinion in terms of what the industry distribution is for the maturity model in DevOps currently? Do you have a view of where most of the industry is stuck? I know you mentioned it's mainly intermediate and advanced, but any other insights on that point?
Yeah, I think like a lot of companies, for example, like Netflix, like they're already at expert level, I would say.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
mean, the Spinnaker is, I mean, one of the tools that was kind of built in-house by Netflix, right? And then basically they kind of decided to open source it like a few years back. So, I mean, there are kind of companies who are kind of an expert, maybe not in all the aspects, but at least in some aspects, and that's where we kind of um, understand and kind of how do we kind of move towards the next level.
Got it. So I'll come back to this in terms of building a business case for an India DevOps team, but I'll leave one of those questions for the end. I'll go back to some more audience question. There are lots coming in. Another one is, in case of microservices, which source control, according to you, is more effective between centralized and distributed?
I mean, we had like both at BMC. We had like both Perforce and we had Git. So I would
Hmm.
say Git is the de facto version control system. And
Hmm.
I think we have not seen any issues with using Git for all of our purpose.
Got it. Got it. Another one is around how many environments do you use for optimal testing? It looks like there is one for single feature testing, one for integration testing, one for solution testing, and one for staging. Wouldn't it delay delivery of features and services if you use different environments?
Yes. So the idea is that, so I mean, all these environments, so this is not really an environment, the dev pipeline, right? I mean, the
Mhm.
QA pipeline is, again, like not a complete full-fledged environment. It is like one
Mhm.
container running with mock services. Right?
Mhm.
And we really have like these four environments here,
Mhm.
right? And then the objective of every environment is different. We want to kind of test all different environments. So certainly, the more environments that you have in your promotion model, it is going to take longer time.
The better.
But the idea is that the idea of breaking this down into different environments and then kind of doing focus testing is that, I mean, you're kind of trying to modularize your activities across the promotion model. And
Mhm.
then, so because of that, you will be able to focus. Let's say in the integration testing, you need to be able to decide like what is it that I need to test, right? And then,
Mhm.
so that's how basically you can kind of improve the quality in this whole process. Otherwise, I mean, it is going to be like, let's say, I mean, if you do not have multiple environments, you will basically try
Mhm.
to test everything, and it will be kind of very very difficult to understand what has failed and what was the reason. So, I mean, you will not be able to measure your KPIs if you are not dividing things into smaller pieces.
Got it. Absolutely. So another question, actually, there are multiple questions around this, but I'll just kind of paraphrase and make it a little bit more generic. In terms of if you could share any guidelines or a detailed use case on how to move from manual to automated testing. So any best practices that you have in your experience that you can share around this shift.
Yeah. So best practices, I would say, like um, the test suite should be kind of simple and easy to understand. And if it is simple and easy, it should be kind of easy to maintain as well. Because
Hmm.
I think more than writing your test suits, it is more important to kind of maintain those test suits over a long period of time and
Right.
ensure that you are able to kind of you kind of have confidence in them. Right? So they should be easy and simple to um, maintain. um, we talked about like there should be, since we divided this into like multiple different stages, there should be no, ideally there should be no overlap on
Hmm.
testing of functionality,
Hmm.
right? And then we again talked about the same thing, like the feedback loop or the test suite should be able to kind of complete really very quickly. I mean, time to completion is very important for each of your test suite, right?
Got
And
it.
And the last and the most important thing is that all the test suits that you are writing should be able to produce relevant metric data that you want to measure at every stage of your promotion. And so basically that's how you will be able to kind of measure those. The tests are really your feedback process, and the information that the test will generate is really what you will measure, right? So that is where I think um, I mean the focus should be, rather
Got
than
it.
saying that the test will be successful. I mean the test is green versus red.
Right. Absolutely. So I'll just quickly summarize to make sure I got it right. Four key things. Number one is quick and easy to create. Number two, track, loop, and time to completion being extremely important, and metric data that you can constantly track. Right?
Right.
Great. So another question on what you do track, just a question on whether you track MTTD and MTTR as part of your metrics.
Yes, certainly. So um, we kind of talked about it, right? The SLAs.
Mhm.
So um, certainly, like, okay, let me kind of go back to the KPI slide.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we do have, the time to, the SLAs certainly needs to be kind of measured, and
Mhm.
basically it is a factor of all the different KPIs that you're kind of trying to measure, right? So that's where I think
Got it.
I would answer that
Got
question.
it. So one last audience question, which will maybe just link to a couple of questions I'd like to leave everybody with. Seth, I know we only have 10 minutes, so I will make it quick. But this question is around, could you give a rough estimate around the investment required for, in terms of percentage, anything that you can, in terms of infra, human resource, and tools, when you're moving towards DevOps being compliant as compared to traditional implementation? So here again, I'm assuming it's the automation shift. But if just in terms of percentages, you could give us something that you're comfortable with, great. If not, it's understandable.
Yeah, I would say it's a great question. Again, I would answer that in a way such that, like, what is the customer experience and the customer value that you're kind of trying to deliver, right?
Mhm.
In the ever changing, I don't think it is about like how much time and investment. So if you have to kind of make a perfect picture, I think it is going
Mhm.
to require a lot of time and investment to kind of
Mhm.
get everything automated. So I think it
Right.
is all about like what is the kind of customer value and the
Mhm.
experience that you want to deliver to your customers. And based on that, you kind of decide like what is the investment that you want to make. Like, do you want to be at base, or you want to be at beginner, intermediate, advanced, etc. It also depends on like what is the business domain, or what is the um, what kind of competition really you are kind of looking at in the market, right? You want to kind of being able to kind of deliver more frequently your changes, right? Because you want to give a better customer experience. You want to be able to kind of deliver the new features as quickly as possible to your customers to kind of delight them, right? And then make
Mhm.
sure that you are kind of handling the competition in a way that your customers will appreciate. So I would say again, it goes back to the same question, like what you want to deliver to your customer. Based on that, we will decide what is the investment and the time that you will kind of put into this process.
Got it. So investment is dependent on multiple different factors. Unfortunately, much like most things, investment is directly proportional to the kind of output that you intend to deliver. And hence, it would be important for organizations to identify which stage of the maturity cycle they'd like to operate in and correspondingly factor in investments accordingly.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, great. So couple of questions that I had, and I hope that this also covers some of the additional audience questions. But you spoke of the importance of a robust feedback loop, as well as the percentage of code completion that you need to attain to in terms of avoiding failure, right? But my question would be, in the situation of failure, what are some key principles that DevOps teams should follow in terms of leveraging suboptimal outcomes and channelizing that back into their systems to make them more accurate or robust? So in situations of failure, what are some guiding principles that you would have for DevOps teams?
I mean, I think it goes back to the same question, I mean, that you asked on like the robust feedback loop, right?
Mm-hmm.
Basically, uh, if you want to really kind of, I mean, the best way to kind of handle failures is to kind of build a robust feedback loop, right? And then we kind of answered that question, like your feedback loop is really your automated test, right? Which tells you
Mm-hmm.
where you are with respect to the quality. So I think the same principles that we talked about, like simple test suits, um, and then there is no overlap across different stages, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then I mean, your test, I mean, you should be able to fail fast, which means that your test suite should complete very quickly and then tell you whether something failed in that particular area or not. And then more importantly, the last thing is that you should be able to measure um, the key metrics that you want to, right, with respect to each stage in the promotion.
Got it. Absolutely. So essentially, the key is still with the feedback loop, and the agenda or the aim would be to fail fast, but hence accordingly grow faster. Yeah. My next question is there a need for organizations to unlearn certain specific ways of operating to fully leverage this ideal DevOps philosophy? So when we're talking about the fact that it is a culture, I just wanted to know whether there are some practices that you think organizations need to unlearn in terms of operating efficiently.
Yeah, maybe unlearn the traditional waterfall models. I don't
Okay.
know if there's a good, again, right answer to this question, but I
Mhm,
would give the same answer, like understanding the need and the benefits of making frequent changes to your product, right? And then willingness to
mhm,
keep the mind open and adapt
mhm.
to that change will certainly break all the barriers that you would have, I would say.
Absolutely. Got it. Thank you so much, Seth. In the interest of time, I have one last question for you in terms of what we'd like to leave the audience with. Could you just share three key takeaways or pieces of advice for anyone who's about to embark on their maturity journey in DevOps? So, for a lot of these teams, especially because our audience are mainly these offshore centers, where can the India team play a much larger role for the global organization in terms of DevOps? And do you have any pieces of advice for them if they're at the very beginning of their maturity journey?
Yeah, sure. I think you kind of, um, yeah. So basically, what I would say is like India. I mean, there are two questions, right? I would say, like you're saying, I
Mhm,
mean, the takeaways certainly, and I would say the takeaways are really you need to be able to enable cross-functional teams across
mhm,
the dev, Q, and ops without
mhm.
compromising the security with respect to customers' data. Right.
Got it.
I think we talked about clearly identifying the KPIs that you
Mhm,
want to achieve with respect to the maturity model and find reliable ways to measure them. And there's not no point in having a KPI that cannot be measured in a reliable way. And
absolutely.
the last thing is, let's say, the enable the governance and uniformity in all your process. I mean, it should be kind of uh, enforced via some form of uh, 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 it should be kind of, let's say, I mean, checked in into your Git repository version control system. So
Mhm,
we talked about templatizing your pipelines, right? So basically that's
mhm,
what you need to strive for, so that there is governance and unity across all your processes, and all your processes are I would say, in other words, are coded somewhere, so that
mhm,
no one can kind of deviate from it. It can be kind of measured, and it can also be reviewed in terms of like how can India DevOps, right? I mean, how can India development centers participate in the DevOps process, right? So I would say, like, again, the same answer, like all these things that we talked about, like building all
mhm,
these different pipelines, etc. I mean, these are really, like, all these pipelines are developed as code and checked into different checked into the version control system.
right.
So really, basically, the India centers can certainly kind of work on building this whole engine, which is this whole pipeline design and everything that we talked about. And then the execution of this engine can certainly be done by whoever I mean, whoever the right authority is in terms of making the decisions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that summary. Again, I'll just quickly summarize to the rest of our audience. Some key takeaways or pieces of advice was number one, to be able to enable cross-functional teams, obviously without compromising customer data security. The second was obviously identify clearly defined KPIs that you can measure in reliable ways. You spoke about enabling governance and uniformity in all processes, and here I'm assuming across all geographies. So templatizing pipelines accordingly. You spoke about the fact that India's role can really be building pipeline design at the core, and that's what India can really drive for the entire global organization. Wherever execution happens in any geography after that is understandable. And lastly, I'll just repeat something that you mentioned earlier in terms of failing fast, and so that your feedback loop is kind of always ensuring that you grow faster as well. Hope I haven't missed anything in that.
No, I think you pretty much covered everything. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. I think that's all we do have time for today, Saif. We really, really appreciate you joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure. For everyone listening in, I hope the session has helped in addressing some of the questions you might have had. I do know that there are loads of questions we weren't able to get to, so we will end up dropping an email to Saif with them and share them with you as soon as he's able to respond. We will also be sharing the slides and recording with any attendee that requests it. So please do drop us an email at events@theradesonove.com for the same. Thank you so much to everyone. Take care and have a great day. Thank you so much, Seth.